The final learning objective for the autonomic nervous system is to compare the neurotransmitters secreted by the different divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Based on the neurotransmitter that a neuron in the autonomic nervous system produces and releases, they're classified as either cholinergic or adrenergic neurons. The receptors for these neurotransmitters are integral proteins which are located in the plasma membrane of the postsynaptic neuron or the effector cell. So cholinergic neurons release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. In the autonomic nervous system, cholinergic neurons include all of our sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic neurons, so the first neuron in all of those chains. They include sympathetic postganglionic neurons that innervate our sweat glands, as well as all parasympathetic postganglionic neurons. In these neurons, acetylcholine is stored in synaptic vesicles and released by exocytosis. It then diffuses across the synaptic cleft and binds with specific cholinergic receptors in the plasma membrane of the postsynaptic neuron. So the two types of cholinergic receptors, both of which bind to acetylcholine, are nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. Nicotinic receptors are found in the plasma membrane of dendrites and cell bodies of both our sympathetic and our parasympathetic postganglionic neurons, the plasma membranes of the chromaffin cells in the adrenal medulla, and in the motor end plate at the neuromuscular junction. Now, neuromuscular junction is just that synapse between a neuron and a muscle. Activation of the nicotinic receptors, which just means when the acetylcholine actually binds to these nicotinic receptors, causes depolarization and thus excitation of the postsynaptic cell. This can either be a postsynaptic neuron or an autonomic effector or a skeletal muscle fiber. Our muscarinic receptors are found in the plasma membranes of all autonomic effectors, so our cardiac muscle, our smooth muscle, and our glands, which are innervated by our parasympathetic postganglionic axons. In addition, most sweat glands are innervated by cholinergic sympathetic postganglionic neurons and possess these muscarinic receptors. Activation of the muscarinic receptors, so when acetylcholine binds to these receptors, sometimes causes depolarization or excitation, and sometimes causes hyperpolarization or inhibition, depending on the cell that actually contains those receptors. So as an example, binding of acetylcholine to muscarinic receptors inhibits or relaxes our smooth muscle sphincters in the gastrointestinal tract, so the food can move through that pathway. Whereas acetylcholine excites or depolarizes muscarinic receptors in smooth muscle fibers in the circular muscles of the iris. So this is what causes your pupil to contract or constrict. Adrenergic neurons in the autonomic nervous system release norepinephrine, which you may also see termed noradrenaline. So they're the same thing. Most of the postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system are classified as adrenergic neurons. And like acetylcholine, norepinephrine is stored in synaptic vesicles and released by exocytosis. Those molecules of norepinephrine diffuse across the synaptic cleft, and they bind to specific adrenergic receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, causing either excitation or inhibition of that effector cell. Adrenergic receptors bind both norepinephrine and epinephrine, or noradrenaline and adrenaline. And that norepinephrine can be released either as a neurotransmitter, so by the sympathetic postganglionic neurons, or it can actually be released as a hormone into the blood by those chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla. So we can release it in two different ways, but it will bind in the same manner to those receptors. So the two main types of adrenergic receptors are alpha receptors and beta receptors. These are found on all of our visceral effectors, which are innervated by sympathetic postganglionic axons. And these receptors are actually further classified into subtypes. So we have type 1 and 2 alpha receptors and types 1, 2, and 3 beta receptors. Now, although there are some exceptions, activation of our alpha 1 and beta 1 receptors generally produces depolarization or excitation, and activation of our alpha 2 and beta 2 receptors causes inhibition of our effector cells. Our beta 3 receptors are only present on the cells of brown adipose tissue, which when they are activated causes thermogenesis or heat production. Now, again, I know that was a lot. It's lots of words. It's even hard to get out. But summarizing that information for you with a bit of an image. And in the autonomic nervous system, neurons are named based on the neurotransmitter that they release. So cholinergic neurons release acetylcholine. Adrenergic neurons release norepinephrine. All preganglionic neurons are cholinergic neurons because they release acetylcholine, and you can see that here. So each of these preganglionic neurons is releasing acetylcholine. Most sympathetic postganglionic neurons are adrenergic neurons because they release norepinephrine. So this is an adrenergic neuron because it releases norepinephrine. The sympathetic postganglionic neurons that innervate sweat glands are cholinergic neurons because they release acetylcholine. So this is our sweat gland here. So this is a cholinergic neuron because it's releasing acetylcholine, as well as all of our parasympathetic postganglionic neurons. So that's what we've got here. Our parasympathetic postganglionic neuron is cholinergic because it's releasing acetylcholine. Lastly, acetylcholine can bind to either nicotinic receptors or muscarinic receptors. Nicotinic receptors, which we can see here, here, and here, produce depolarization or excitation. That's good. We want this action potential to pass all the way along our motor pathway, so it produces depolarization of that ganglion. Binding of acetylcholine to our muscarinic receptors can produce either depolarization or hyperpolarization. Now, noradrenaline binds to adrenergic receptors. So we have our adrenergic receptors up here. These can either be our alpha or our beta receptors. And remember, we have a number of different subtypes. Alpha and beta 1 receptors cause depolarization, and alpha and beta 2 receptors typically cause hyperpolarization.